Hey, good morning. This is Brother Garfield from the Brother Garfield podcast, and today I have a special guest. It's Dr. Lester Grabbe. Grabbe. I hope I pronounce it properly. He's a retired American scholar and emeritus professor of Hebrew Bible and early Judaism at the University of Hull in England. He has wrote many books, and he has really touched on actually the Bible as far as Second Temple period. He has touched on a couple of his books. Let me just put them on the screen for folks to look at. Ancient Israel, What Do We Know? He also has a history of the Jews and Judaism in the Second Temple period. Judaism from Cyrus to Hadrian. And another book is The Priests, the Prophets, Diviners, and Sages. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, let me present to you someone I'm a big fan of. I've read many of his works, and it's an honor to actually speak to you for the first time in my life. But ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Lester Grabbe. How are you, sir?
I'm fine, thank you.
All right. So what do you do right now for you're retired, but you're still teaching. Am I correct?
I'm not teaching, but I basically do research, which is was the thing I loved most about my job as an academic. Obviously, teaching was very important and was rewarding. Administration, I had to do a lot of that, and I wouldn't say I found that so interesting or so rewarding, but I did some good there, I think. But research was the main thing that I really liked. And so basically I'm spending my retirement doing research.
Beautiful. We need you. I think you're a great mind. You've added a lot to the conversation about Israel from its inception, or not inception, but from its origins as far as the development of Israel. What would you say? Because there's many different perspectives have come over the years. You hear Finkelstein come with one angle, you hear different people come, Mizar and different angles. Where are you right now as far as your perspective of how Israel came to be?
Well, I don't think that the biblical text gives us a reliable historical picture. That is, it gives us a picture perhaps as a way of illustrating not only what people thought, but also illustrating the way people should live. In other words, the early chapters of Genesis, early chapters of the Bible, give us a perspective on the religious side of things, but not necessarily a historical one. Obviously, Israel was around. We have its first mention in an Egyptian inscription about 1200 before the Common Era. The inscription of Merneptah is the Egyptian king who was at that time toward the end of the 19th dynasty. And so we know Israel existed then. Now, exactly what shape it was, we don't know, because he doesn't describe it, but he says he defeated it. He says he destroyed it. So it's not a story of the Exodus, as some people have wanted to say. It's something else. But then after that, we don't have the name Israel mentioned for another 400 years. Until about 850, we have a reference to Ahab the Israelite. And that's the first time Israel is mentioned after that. And outside the biblical text, of course. And so there's a big gap in there that we have to try to fill in. The thing is that archaeology has become extremely important in the last few years. You mentioned Israel Finkelstein. You mentioned Amichai Mazar. Also his uncle, I think it was Benjamin Mazar, was an archaeologist. But archaeology is extremely important, and archaeology hasn't shown a conquest of Canaan as we find in the Bible, in especially the book of Joshua. So, sorry?
Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
All right. So instead, we've tried to piece it together with archaeology, but also with other the few references we find. We know that Egypt had control of Palestine through much of the second millennium BCE, certainly from about 1600 to about 1100, maybe 1150, somewhere around there. Egypt was the dominant power in that area. And so anything that was in the area of Canaan would have been under or subject to the rule of Egypt. And so when Meneptah mentions Israel as a people he defeated, we don't know exactly what happened, but it does suggest there was an entity called Israel in Palestine. But it doesn't seem to be quite the Israel that we later think of. And when it comes to the early monarchy, the kings of Saul, David, Solomon, they're not mentioned elsewhere. They're not mentioned by the Egyptians. They're not mentioned by any other people. So we fall back on what we can get from the biblical text and from archaeology. And archaeology doesn't tend to confirm the picture that we find in the Bible. It doesn't mean there wasn't an Israel. It doesn't mean there weren't people living there. The city of Jerusalem seems to have been around, but it wasn't the great capital of a great empire under Solomon, as the story of Solomon seems to picture it. It looks like it was a much smaller entity. And in fact, you have in the story of Saul, it mentions that he met with his council of, looks like the leading leaders of the country under a tree. So it seems that it was probably a small nation. Some people have, I mean, from a sociological point of view, there are different ideas of how countries should be labeled. And some have said, well, it was a tribal state. Others have used other terms, so the original Israel was probably fairly small, didn't cover a huge area, and even under David, it began to expand. We do have one mention of David apparently in an inscription, not of him directly, but of his dynasty. It mentions about the house of David, which seems to be, there have been different interpretations of that, but it seems to be, most would say it's probably a reference to his dynasty. So it suggests there was a person named David who founded a ruling family of some sort, a dynasty of some sort. But beyond that, we don't have confirmation. But the story of David looks to me like it has a lot of good material in it. I don't mean that I believe every detail is can be accepted, but I think the story of a person who carried who sort of led a band of bandits almost against the Philistines, who thrived for a time and then was eventually invited by the son of Saul to, not the son of Saul, the son of Saul had been killed by that time, but was invited by actually one of Saul's family to become king over not only Judah, but Israel. That to me seems plausible. I think that seems to be, but again, it's a small nation, not a huge, mighty one. Mm-hmm. And, but then when we come down and get past Solomon and get down to Rehoboam and Jeroboam,
right,
I think we start to get into some material, even in the biblical text. This is based on some sort of chronicle that was kept by the kings. And while there's not a lot of information in that chronicle, we seem to have it quoted here and there from the time of Rehoboam on. So we start to see, I think, and then as we get further down, I think we get more and more coincidence between the biblical text and the historical reality. So I see certainly a development there and I'm speaking as a historian. I'm not speaking as you might say, as a theologian. A
Right.
theologian would be interested in the text for the benefit of morality, of theology, and so on,
Right.
and would, of course, give a different emphasis to it than I am. But I work a lot in history, so I tend to take a historical perspective.
Would you say that based on what you have found your entire career as a historian,
Yes.
that you would intend to believe David and Solomon as possibly real people, but
Yes.
look at the patriarchs, it's more of a part of the etiology of trying to have a common origin where you came from, as far as the writers.
That's correct. We really don't have uh, certainly in the view of most critical scholars, we don't really have a mention of Abraham and the patriarchs in the text until about the 8th century, 700s. And so what lies behind that is very difficult to get at from a historical point of view. So when you see the stories of Abraham, some of those don't fit the time. They don't fit the archaeology of that particular time. They may fit a later period in archaeology. So
Right.
I would see the patriarchal stories as being developed. Perhaps there were patriarchs lying behind them, but they developed over a long period of time. They don't necessarily represent an early period. But once we get to David and Solomon, I personally believe there were actual individuals. David, I think, as I say, is attested in an inscription. Solomon is not, but he looks to me like an actual individual, though I think quite a bit different from the biblical picture of him. And then after that, it's not long before we actually have kings mentioned in, for instance, the Assyrian inscriptions. Ahab is mentioned by the Assyrians.
Right.
So, this is around 850 before the Common Era. So it's still a fairly early time.
Right. Do you see how do you picture as a historian Israel after the Assyrians had Tiglath-Pileser and Sargon II had destroyed the northern kingdom, and they took folks away, deported them, and brought people in? Do you see Israel at that point, from the writer's perspective, when they're writing later on, is the memory that they're writing about specifically pre-Second Temple period, going backwards, see Israel from memory that you're trying to recreate in the text?
I think so. I think they're probably writing things down and have records, certainly from about the 700s, which is before the Second Temple period. And as I say, we have references in the Assyrian inscriptions, which are contemporary. That is, they were written down at the time things were happening. And they coincide in many cases with the biblical text. Sometimes there's differences, and there's occasionally gaps. For instance, Josiah, who's a very important king in Judah, he's not mentioned in the Assyrian records. We don't have any records of him. So occasionally there are gaps, but we have a record of the fall of Samaria, the northern kingdom of Israel. In the Assyrians mention that the city was conquered.
Right.
They don't give us a lot of detail, but they confirm and about the time. It looks like from archaeology that probably not too many Israelites were actually taken out of the land. Some of them were deported to Assyria, we know that, but and some people were brought in, but it probably wasn't a complete displacement of the population, as you might gather from the text. It was probably more a portion of the population. Maybe some of the upper class were deported and others brought in.
Right.
So but there we're talking about the northern kingdom. Judah, of course, continued to exist for another 100, almost 150 years.
Okay. Let me okay, so let's get to the Second Temple period. And you just said something about another 150 years. So during the Persian period, do
Right.
we consider northern Israel at that point? Is it considered in the documents from outside sources Israel? Because I think this is where the studies kind of, for like a believer from a theological point of view and from a historical point of view, we might have a clash. We look at Israel as having, I wouldn't say puppet kings, but technically they were paying money to make sure that, tribute. They were paying tribute to either the Babylonians, to the Assyrians, or even at one point to the Egyptians. Do we see a Israel from 720 BC to the Babylonian time period? Do we see another Israel being called Israel at that time?
Not that I'm aware of. The term in the Assyrians talk about Israel, of course. Once the Samaria fell and it was taken over, they then talk about Judah, but the people didn't disappear, but they didn't seem to have a lot of influence or power. They were no longer a nation. They were under Assyrian rule.
Right.
And for a long period. And so we don't hear too much about the Northern Kingdom. Obviously, we have archaeology, but the text doesn't say too much about them. We have during the time of Hezekiah, the text talks about his interaction with the with the people in the north. He invited them to the Passover and so on, at least according to the text. But we don't have much there. And the term Israel seems to be being used in the text often as a reference, not only for the old Israel, the northern kingdom, but for Judah as well. But that's not the case with external sources. The external sources refer to Judah and the Jews, but they don't call them Israelites. And in fact, the term Israel sort of disappears from external sources for many centuries. If you look at the Greek and Roman texts that mention the Jews, they never refer to them as Israel. They're always referred to as Judah, and the country is Judah, and the people as Jews or Judeans, however you wish to translate the words being used there. So the name Israel sort of disappears for a time, except in the biblical text. And in Jewish sources, they do talk about Israel and seem to consider themselves Israel.
Right. So in the formation now, I would like for you to wear a hat you don't normally wear, which is a theological hat for a second.
Yeah.
And so now we're getting, so with that being said, from a historical point of view, I'm trying to walk you audience into the works of Dr. Grabbe. And because a lot of people in my community might not know who you are, but they're going to know a lot about you after today. So we're in a period from 720 to around 586 when Nebuchadnezzar is controlling Babylon. We don't see a reference to Israel like for centuries, actually. Not to even exact, we're not even using hyperbole right now. This is like, you don't see the term Israel being used. But the theological writers, the creative writers, as I call them, when they're writing the history now from the past and writing it retroactively, they're talking about Israel like it's coming through. In your historical background, as far as Israel is concerned and Judaism being developed, do you see a reflection, like you have a book about Leviticus, do you see a reflection of the laws being practiced by the northern Israel family or the southern Judeans, the way how we see it being portrayed in the biblical text?
Yes, the Jewish people definitely carry that on, and they seem, as I say, within the biblical text, they do seem to take on the name Israel, which they probably didn't have at an early time. During the monarchy, they weren't Israel, but at this time they seem to take it on, and and therefore. And also they inherited the tradition that included traditions from the northern kingdom. And Leviticus, for instance, was an important book, and we began to find influence from that and from other writings from the northern kingdom on Judaism. So yes, it's a part of their heritage.
Right. All right. So let's get into the conversation I really am interested in is Second Temple Judaism and the
Right.
leading up to the development of what we call Judaism today.
Yes.
Let me ask you a question off the bat. Is the Judaism, well, scholars consider it Israelite religion. So there's a difference between Israelite religion and Judaism. Am I correct?
That I would say that because Israelite religion, of course, covers several centuries, so obviously it didn't stay the same. But Israelite religion, for instance, I think started out the Israelites were originally polytheists, and it was
Mhm.
only over time that monotheism developed. But by the time we get to Judaism, monotheism is the main characteristic of Judaism. So there are differences, but a lot of it is inherited too.
Yeah. Is that shown with the Elephantine Jews when they were there under Darius, and you see all these Elephantine letters? Do we get a sense of those people were pre Second Temple Jews because of them being so polytheists?
Well, it's interesting with them because I consider them Second Temple Jews. They're in the Persian period, and I include the Persian period in Second Temple Judaism. There, as a sort of a footnote, there was some writers wanted to start with the Greek period and sort of ignore the Persian period. This was back decades ago, and but now most will include Persian period, and a lot of the developments that we find in Second Temple Judaism began in the Persian period
Mhm.
because now there was no king. There was only that high priest was the main figure.
Right.
And of course, he was a religious figure, but he also took on what we would call political roles as well. He wasn't in charge because the Jews were generally under a foreign power. They were under an empire of some sort. But often the high priest was the representative of the Jewish community to that empire,
Right.
or at
Right.
least was one of the representatives. So there was a lot of developments that came out of the Persian period that continued on in Judaism. But the Elephantine community is very important because, again, we don't have a lot of sources for the Persian period, other than we have the biblical text and we have archaeology. But unlike with, say, Assyria, when Assyria was in charge, the Persians didn't leave us any records about the Jews. So even though they ruled over that area, they didn't write history in the same way. And much of what we know about the Persian Empire comes from the Greeks. And they don't generally mention the Jews as well, at least not Judea, not the country of Judah. They sometimes refer to Jewish individuals who were in their population for some reason or another. So the Elephantine is very important, and there we have a lot of material in Aramaic. We have letters and so on. And the interesting thing is, though, their religion. You said they're polytheists, and they sort of seem to be polytheists. That they have their own temple to Yahoo, which is a form of Yahweh.
Right.
So they worship there, but they don't. And they do have in a couple of texts, which are sort of they take up offerings for a couple of other deities. And the question is were they polytheists because they worship these, or did these deities represent perhaps a hypostasis, to use the technical term, of Yahoo? Some think that was the case. The reason they think that is because nowhere do we find them actually worshiping these deities.
Yes.
There are no temples to them that we know of. And as I say, they're only mentioned in a couple of texts where they do take up a collection. So there's something there, but it's a little bit unclear as to what the purpose of it is. And we know they keep the Passover because we have a letter which talks about it. It's not, the word Passover is not used because the text is partially destroyed. It probably, the original had the word Pascha, the Aramaic word for Passover, but it does describe the unleavened bread and the various practices there. So there's that. There are a few side references to the Sabbath, Shabbat. It's clear that they worship, as I say, Yahoo. So their religion is very much Jewish, but it's interesting that they nowhere refer to Moses or Aaron or the Pentateuch, the Torah. And it seems very clear that they didn't have what we call the Torah, which we think of as the basis of Judaism. Instead, what they had were practices and that they inherited by tradition. They had priests,
Right.
Though they don't use the term Levites. They call them they're simply priests, and so they did function in the temple that they had there. So they're an interesting community. And in trying to interpret in how they relate, say, to Jerusalem, they knew about Jerusalem. They knew who the high priest was because they wrote a letter to him.
Yep. And I think the Samaritans too in the north. I think they also wrote to them.
Yeah, sorry. Well, what that's a long history and a long debate. The reason is that the temple they had was destroyed by some Egyptian priests.
Right.
There was a shrine in that area to the Egyptian god Khnum, who was a ram-headed god, and some think it may be because they were offering lambs on their altar or something like that. That maybe this was an insult. We don't know. That's speculation because we don't know why it was destroyed, but we do know that it was destroyed. And so they tried to get it rebuilt, and they wrote various letters. They wrote to the high priest in Jerusalem, and they asked for help from them. They didn't get a reply that we know of. That is, no reply was found in the archive. Some have said, well, the high priest wasn't interested because they had their temple and they disapproved of it. Well, that may be the case, but we really don't know. The high priest may not have got the letter that was sent to him. He may have replied and it got lost. Maybe he replied and they got it, but it wasn't, there's so many possibilities there. We don't know. But they did also write to the governor of Egypt, the Persian governor, right. And they did get a reply, and they asked, first of all, they asked permission to set up the altar and to offer sacrifices, as they had animal sacrifices. And we don't quite know how that was received, but it may be there was a negative reception. But then they sent another letter in which they simply said they would offer grain offerings, but not animals. And that was accepted. The reply that came back from the Persians said, you can do this, you can, offer grain offerings and so on. So they were given permission. And apparently from archaeology, the correspondence stops about that time and we don't have any further information. But the archaeology indicates that the temple was restored for a period of time and then gradually fell into disuse. So we don't know the full story there, but apparently it was restored. But the offerings that they offered didn't include animals anymore. So it's an interesting vignette into a little peephole into the story.
Where would you rank that form of Judaism between the Israelite religion and actual Judaism? Would you put it in the middle, or is it an evolving Israelite religion?
No, I think they were Jews who came to settle. They weren't from the northern kingdom, as far as we can tell. They came at the beginning of the Persian period. They may have been even brought there by the Persians, perhaps as mercenaries or as a military settlement or something like that. They seem to have perhaps been descendants of soldiers, and they were Jews. So, but on the other hand, they probably had the religion that they had in around 600, 550 or somewhere around there. Mm-hmm. And no, it probably was a little bit later than that, probably more like probably closer to 500, but that they were brought there. So they seem to have had the religion that was part of Judaism at that time. But again, Judaism evolved, it developed. Yeah. And it may be that they saw nothing wrong with having a temple separate from the one in Jerusalem. And we do know that later on, even one of the high priests in the time of the Maccabees fled to Egypt and set up his own temple there.
I think it was
So
Leontopolis. Was that Leontopolis, I think?
that's Leontopolis, and that's right. And so the question of more than one temple apparently was a debated issue. And so
Against the law, though? Was it against the law in Deuteronomy, though? That's the key, though.
Well, according to Deuteronomy, it was, but we don't know how influential Deuteronomy was. As I say, in Elephantine, they didn't have Deuteronomy, as far as we can tell. They don't. It's not in their documents, and they never refer to it. Good. So exactly how things were developing is still there's still a lot of questions.
You know what? You see that you brought that up, and we talked about Deuteronomy, Leontopolis, and the whole temple stuff.
Yeah.
When do you think? Obviously, I believe from my research that a part of Deuteronomy was written in 7th century BC. There's proof of that. I mean, we could use the Esarhaddon Treaty, compare it with the Deuteronomy 28 and Deuteronomy 13, and we could see like different things happening at that time, historically speaking. But what would you say as far as the first 5 books? When do you see like the composition as far as being developed? When do you see that started?
I think parts of the tradition go back, as you say, Deuteronomy, but other parts of it, I think, go back to the 8th century, to the 700s. Mm-hmm. I don't see any problem with that. But I don't think the whole thing was written down then. I think the whole Pentateuch was finally put into final form after the time of the Elephantine documents. In other words, probably in the what we would call the 4th century, the 300s, I think is when the Pentateuch becomes, as I say, put in final form. The material was around. There are a lot of passages go back earlier, I think. So it's made up of different ones, but it's like a modern editor who takes documents here and there and material from here and there and puts them together. Mm-hmm. And the final form you date to a particular time, but elements of it go back much earlier. So Deuteronomy, a lot of Deuteronomy, I think, is the 8th century. I agree with you on that.
What would you say about Yehud, which is Judah during the time of the Persian period? They what would you say as far as the size, what they were doing at the time in Yehud? What was it that we don't know, but we don't know in general?
Well, we don't know a lot of the detail of their history at that time. We have some idea of the size of it. Yehud, of course, is just the Aramaic term for Judah. Right. In Hebrew, it'd be Yehudah, and Aramaic, it comes out as just Yehud. And it covered an area including Jerusalem and going down to further south. It went perhaps toward the east, getting toward the Dead Sea, a little bit ways in the west. I don't think it included the Shephelah or maybe bits of it. And so, but it wasn't a huge territory. It was a province. It was a Persian province. And the northern part was another province, Samaria. And some of this we get from books of Nehemiah and Ezra, which are problematic. I think Ezra especially, I think, is problematic from a historical point of view. But Nehemiah, I think parts of Nehemiah were written by Nehemiah himself. And so I think he was governor at one point over Yehud. And so we have some perhaps incidents there that he would have in his account. But much of that period of 200 years we're talking about of the Persian rule, we really don't know much about what was happening, except what we can find from archaeology. And of course, archaeology doesn't tell us individual happenings very often, right, or individual people. It simply tells us how the culture developed and things like this.
Okay. All right, let's take a step back a little bit and let's look at the Cyrus cylinder for a minute.
Yeah.
A lot of folks believe that the Cyrus cylinder is referring to the Jews returning, that he gave them permission to return. And this is one of the things that you talked about before that I actually gravitated to your writings. Can you explain to us what was going on in the Cyrus cylinder, and are the Jews even talked about in the Cyrus cylinder?
To answer your last question, the Jews specifically are not referred to in the Cyrus cylinder. The Cyrus cylinder, it comes out, have to go back to the end of Babylonian rule. The last king of the Babylonians was Nabonidus, and he favored a particular god, the god Sin, who was the moon god, and has nothing to do with our word sin. It just happens to be accidentally. Just keep that in mind. But he actually went for a decade to the far west, to an area around Tema, because that was I think a stronghold of this particular worship, and he abandoned the Babylonian priesthood, and of course their main god was Marduk, and he really left them in a quandary because they didn't like what he was doing, but of course he was king and they couldn't do much about it. And so his memory was left as a bad memory in the Babylonian tradition. But anyway, he returned to Babylon, and he was there when Cyrus came and conquered it, the Persian king. And Nabonidus was taken captive, and he was treated well by Cyrus and apparently lived out his life, and he wasn't treated badly or anything. And he seems to be the figure behind the Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel, by the way. Some of the things about Nabonidus seem to fit the image of Nebuchadnezzar there.
Yes, sir.
So Cyrus, of course, when he, one of the things that Nabonidus did, one of the last things he did, and I think it was because the Persians were coming, he was back in Babylon and the Persians were, he knew the Persian army was advancing. He had the gods from all the various temples brought into Babylon, from the temples around about in the Babylonian area. He had the statues brought in, and this was quite obviously, if you had a statue of your god in your temple and he took it away, this was a traumatic thing. And so what Cyrus did was he issued in the Cyrus cylinder a proclamation. It included several different things, but he basically said that the gods, that is the statues, could be returned, and the people who had been displaced could be returned. The cylinder itself is only referring to specifically the Babylonian area. But we infer from that that he allowed other displaced peoples to return to their country of origin. And this is why in the book of Ezra, we have that the Jews are permitted to return to Judah, the ones who wanted to. So although the Cyrus cylinder doesn't mention specifically the Jews, there is no Persian support for what we find in Ezra. That is, we don't find a similar document or decree parallel to compare with it. Nevertheless, the Cyrus cylinder does suggest this was a general policy of Cyrus. So we're extrapolating from that, but it does make sense.
Okay. This book here by Cornelia Wunsch and Laurie Pierce, which documents 200 tablets, actually helped academia on a whole to figure out what was going on in Babylon and so forth.
Yeah.
And then you also have the Marashal Archive, which was years before that. Does that contradict the narrative that we've held on for many years with the biblical text, seeing that Nebuchadnezzar offered them apparently income producing land to a lot of the Judeans as a way to encourage them to move, to basically build up his own empire, instead of we looking at it as he brought everybody over as slaves.
Well, yeah. He first of all, it seems fairly clear that he didn't take the entire population out. You've got the impression again from the biblical text that maybe he took the whole population out. And but if you read in the end of Jeremiah, for instance, Jeremiah 51, I think it is, it says Nebuchadnezzar, and it refers to, I think, 3 different deportations. He took these people, deported them to Babylonia, and it only amounts to a few thousand. Mm-hmm. And the population was bigger than that, I think, we think. So he took and of course he took some of the upper class, some of the crafts people, the people with special skills. And of course they didn't have any choice. He didn't invite them. He did compel them. On the other hand, they weren't necessarily slaves. They were, they were taken to a new area. They were given apparently property and were allowed to make a living. We don't know the details. The biblical text doesn't tell us. But then the documents that you refer to there, that Bunch and Laurie Pearson published, and these are, and I think there's still some more they have to publish. They show that they give us some perspective, because they talk about the Jewish community or Jews who were living in Babylonia, who seem to be from that. And in fact, they refer to the city of Judah. They actually use that term in Babylonia. I don't know if they...
Al-Yahudu, the Judah.
Yeah. I don't think they use the name Jerusalem. I don't think the name Jerusalem appears, as I recall, but it's Al-Yahuda. And so they actually... And if you read through the documents and work through them as they have, you find some idea of how the people were living. They apparently had different occupations, different crafts they worked on, and so on. And they would have helped the Babylonians in that sense. They were part of the economy. They weren't slaves, but on the other hand, I don't think they were. They were generally. They probably were at the working end of things. They weren't upper class. The Murashu documents are a little bit different. They are Persian documents. The Murashu family was a entrepreneurial family. They had a lot of property, and they also managed a lot of property and rented it out and managed it for upper class people and so on. But some of the people who were working for them have Jewish names, and we don't have a lot of detail about individuals except the names, but it does indicate that, again, Jews were making their way in society, and some of them were able to better themselves and to work their way up, socially. Others would have been at the very bottom of the pecking order, as you say. Again, some may have been slaves, but the majority were not, apparently.
Okay. When we look at historical Israelites and comparing it to the biblical Israelites, what is the biggest, I won't say conundrum, but what is the biggest differences that you see between the biblical Israelites reading the story as a theologian and then reading it as a historian? What is the biggest differences you've seen?
The biggest differences come in the earlier period, where Israel has made a giant empire. That you have even David conquers way far north into the Aramean area, which I think is unlikely that he would have advanced that far. His conquest would have been, I think, around more locally, around the area of Jerusalem. And I think he did. It says he took Jerusalem. I think that, again, is a credible account there, and made it his capital. But the biblical text doesn't suggest he had a huge empire. And then suddenly we get to Solomon, and he's a he's an enormous empire. He's all the way
Huge.
from Asia Minor down to the edge of Egypt, and that is just doesn't make sense in the resources that Israel had, the resources that the land had. It doesn't make any sense in that there's no reference to it in any of the Egyptian sources, for instance, which would have probably mentioned that. So it's mainly there that I find some difficulties. But after that, you have the two kingdoms, Judah and Israel. That I think makes sense, because Judah and Israel actually, Judah was always separate. If you read through and look at the various indications, Judah always, it only became united, I think, briefly under David and Solomon, that there was a united monarchy.
Right.
But then they separated back into what was their normal situation. For instance, if you read the Song of Deborah and Judges 5,
right.
you don't have any reference to Judah.
Or Simeon, right.
You have, yeah, they're not another, but Simeon wasn't a major tribe, whereas Judah, you would have thought, Judah would be referred to there, but it's not.
Right, very true.
And so it's probably because Judah was separate from the other tribes. No, you're right that the situation described in the Song of Deborah is a little different from what we find elsewhere. You also don't have Manasseh, but you have, Machir, I think. And so, yeah, so you have some slight differences there, but you have a number of the tribes are referred to, and but Judah is not. So I think you have the two split up, but the text of Kings concentrates on Judah. It's from a Judean perspective, not from an Israelite perspective, and it seems that probably Judah may have even been a vassal of Israel for part of that time, under, for instance, the Omride kings, Omri, Ahab, Judah. Some think it was a vassal, others think it was just dominant. But of course, the text is very much against Omri. It hardly gives any space to Omri. 12 verses, I think, who was a major king, because the Assyrians refer to him. They refer to the northern kingdom as Bit Omri, which means the house of Omri. So he was obviously important. Ahab, it has a huge section on Ahab, but much of it is given over to the prophet Elijah. So and Ahab is considered a very evil king, a wicked king. Right. But it looks like Ahab was an important ruler, however you regard it. He was an important ruler with a lot of power and so on. And he was an ally of against the Assyrians, an ally with the Arameans against the Assyrians, who were trying to take over that area. And he and his allies were stopping them. So Ahab was an important figure, and they were probably dominant. And Judah was probably a backwater at that time, but it gradually came and developed. And then when Israel was ceased, was conquered by the Assyrians, Judah, of course, was under Assyrian control. They were a vassal of the Assyrians and so on, but they were left to develop, and they did seem to develop much better after that, and become more prosperous and so on, though they were conquered by Sennacherib, and that a lot of their country was devastated for a period of time, but they seem to have recovered from that. So in that period, a lot of what we find in the biblical text makes a lot of sense. Not all of it, I think. Again, the biblical writer takes sides. He judges kings by whether he thinks they were obedient or not. Okay. And therefore, the picture we get is a theological one, not a political one. Manasseh was, again, probably quite an important king, but he's considered very bad by the writer, and so he doesn't get a very good picture.
Okay. All right. So now, what would be something that you probably observed from a historical perspective from the priesthood during the Greek period and the priesthood in the Roman period up to Hadrian?
Well, the priesthood, as I say, the high priest was the representative. Through the Persian period, there was a Persian governor over Judah, but sometimes it might have actually been the high priest, but the high priest seems to have had a function alongside the governor, and had a certain duty to represent the Jews, as well as a religious duty, of course. In the Greek period, it continued like that. The high priest was still a representative, apparently. But then when we got down to the time of the Maccabees, so that's not very far into the Greek period. If you think of Alexander as coming around 330, the Maccabean period starts about 175. So you have a century and a half there, in which the Seleucids rule for a period of time and are in charge. And the high priest, though, again, carries on his function. But then we got to about 175. We got the Maccabean revolt. They fight the Seleucids. Eventually, their initial fight is to take the temple back. The temple is polluted, and they want to restore it, which they do. But then the Maccabees carry on the fight. They want to become independent. And a lot of the Jews apparently weren't concerned to become independent. And the Maccabees, for a period of time, didn't get much support. But keep in mind, the Maccabees were priests. And so you have a priestly group who were leaders, not just from a religious point of view, but become military leaders and political leaders as well. So the high priesthood becomes quite important. And so the Hasmonean rulers, who eventually even take the title king, are also priests. So you have this interesting thing. They combine the two offices. But then when the Romans come, they take away the kingship. They take control. And at this point, the Herodian family comes on the scene. It's a whole complicated thing, and obviously we don't have time to go into it. But the family of Herod is not priestly, but he becomes an important ruler, and he's a client king under the Romans. And some of those followers of the Hasmoneans continue to try to take control again, but they're fighting against the Romans as well. They're not fighting just against Herod, but against the Romans, and they haven't any possibility of winning. And under Herod, the priests don't have a huge lot of influence. They control the temple, they carry on the religion, but they don't have a lot of other influence. But then it gets complicated in the first century. You have a period in which Judea becomes a Roman province, and you have the Roman governors. And then you have a Herodian becomes king again, and Agrippa, the first, as he's called, becomes king but he's for a short period of time, and then it becomes a Roman province again. So when it's a Roman province, obviously there's a Roman governor, but the priest is looked up to as a leader. And it's the priests who seem to be some of the leaders when we finally have the revolt against Rome in 66 to 70. And although Josephus, who writes about this and is our main source, he tries to make it as if the upper class and the priests weren't really interested. He does admit that they were taking part, but he thinks they're being forced into it, he says. But actually, they probably, a lot of the leadership was probably priestly. But then once the temple is destroyed in 70, the priests no longer have a function. And although various individuals through the rabbinic period for the next several centuries are referred to as being priests, Kohen, as we would say today, and still there are people who not only have the name Cohen, but have a tradition that they're part of the priests and so on. They have no real function. And so any prestige they have is purely personal and a matter of influence, but there's no official function for priests after that. Sorry.
I forgot to mute my mic. Pardon me.
Yeah.
All right. I forgot to bring this up earlier, and we keep talking about priests, priests, priests. There was a change from being kings, kings, kings. Then it became more of like a priesthood being in charge instead of the kings, and that's probably
right.
one of the major changes from the early pre-Second Temple Judaism to Second Temple Judaism. So, would you agree that's what a major change was? The priesthoods.
That was a major change, and that happened in the Persian period. This is why I say a lot of the things that happened in the Persian period were very influential for not only Second Temple Judaism, but for the continual development of Judaism. And one of the main ones was there was no longer a king, and therefore the priest, the high priest especially, but the priest as a whole, and the temple was important under the monarchy, of course, but the temple becomes quite central. So the priesthood was a major. The development of the priesthood was a major change and a major important one. Yes.
Do you see the Persian culture being a major influence of that? Seeing that their culture also probably dealt with a lot of priesthoods having a lot of influence on the leadership.
I don't think directly. The Persian priests were Zoroastrians, and we do probably have some influence on Judaism from Zoroastrianism. I don't see much of it in the biblical text. Maybe I'm just not seeing it, but I don't see a lot of Zoroastrian influence in the biblical text. But I think the biblical text was, some parts of it were completed later, but a lot of it was complete by the end of the Persian period, I think. But we do find, for instance, in some people have written on this. This is a specialty, so not many have written on it, but there does seem to be some Zoroastrian influence on Judaism, and but I don't see a lot from. I'm trying to think what would be unique from the Persian point of view. Of course, the priests, but you know, the Babylonians and the Syrians had priests and temples and so on. So the Persians weren't different in that regard.
What about the one God worship, the stamping of it in Isaiah 45? Do you think that's a major part?
I'm not sure that came from the Persians. I think that was already a development within Judaism. I think it was already developing that way. There might have been some influence, but keep in mind that Zoroastrians didn't have just one god. They had two gods, an evil god and a good god. They had Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, who was the evil god, although Ahura Mazda is fated to win out in the end, the two of them sort of fight or share things through history. So they weren't strictly speaking monotheistic. But I think monotheism was developing. I think it took time, and I think a lot of the bits of polytheism were edited out as the text was written. I think earlier things, but you still find traces here and there. That's the interesting thing. We know it was there because there's still bits left, and so. But I'm not sure that I would see Persia as influencing that. I think by the time we got to Second Isaiah, that's probably pre-Persian. So, and I think there, at least to my mind, that we have monotheism. Some people don't accept that, but I do.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna leave it there. We did like almost a whole hour. It went by so fast. But Dr. Grabbe, I think you're a great mind, and I hope to have you back so we could expand some more on the Second Temple Judaism as far as the priesthood. And it was a pleasure talking to you, sir. Pleasure.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's early in the morning. Garfield here doing interviews, but hey, I had one of the great historians who's currently in England, and I just want to again thank him for taking the time out of his busy schedule to come on. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Peace and one love.